All right, so here we are getting started on chapter 22, the Roaring Twenties, or the New Era, as the book calls it. That means after this, we only got 10 chapters left, so we are just rolling through everything. This is kind of an interesting chapter, relatively short, but it really does a good job, I think, capturing some of the main points of the 1920s and how America responded to, this unprecedented period of growth. Again, we're going to look at reasons why that happened, your cause and effect again, and understand what allowed this growth to kind of happen throughout the course of the 20s. So let's get started. All right, so this is a period of great economic prosperity in the country. And I don't know why when I transfer these slides over to this, why it moves these things over, but whatever. Um, anyway, um, so the 1920s marks a period of great economic prosperity. The economy grew tremendously throughout the decade with very little interruption. There was a brief downturn in like 1923, but that subsided quickly, and economic growth continued really up until 1929, and the stock market crashed. And that wasn't an immediate thing. When the stock market crashed in 1929 on Black Tuesday, the it took time for the economy to um, really falter and fall and really affect everybody in the Great Depression. And we didn't really hit the bottom point in the Depression until 1932. So it was a long, drawn out drop, but we'll get to that later. Um, but the 1920s represents this great period of economic prosperity. And it's largely because of a great deal of new technology, organizational practices, and other things that really helped the economy grow substantially during this era. We see new technologies really flourish during the 20s, particularly radio, uh, movies, things like that, for entertainment purposes. Um, New fabrics and things like upholsteries and things like nylon and all that stuff grows tremendously during the 20s. The book mentions early computers. Um, I don't think that's important enough at this time to really count that as something that really matters. But we see our earliest computing devices, kind of during the 1920s. But that's only of limited significance. The biggest thing of significance, which shouldn't surprise you based on the picture in the background, is of cars. Um, and the automobile industry is extremely important in America during the 1920s. Okay, not only because of the vast availability now of cars with more and more people getting them, but everything that goes into making a car and how many other industries that building a car impacts. We see this huge growth in car sales, and what that means is that you're going to see growth in a lot of other industries as well. Because think of everything that goes into making a car. Leather or cloth for upholstery, obviously rubber for tires, glass that go into various portions of the vehicle. Obviously, steel industry, tools and dies, things of that nature. Electrical pieces that are part of making a car work, and obviously gas and oil because people need to fill their cars to drive them. So there's all these industries that benefit substantially from the growing popularity of the car. On top of that, you also see construction industry start to flourish in the 1920s in two ways. Number one, because we have more and more cars, we need to build roads. So we're building more and more roads in the 1920s. So that's a huge money maker, a huge industry, and a huge job provider. We start to see, now that people have cars, we start to see people move further and further away from the cities with the beginnings of suburbs being built and emerging. So that creates yet another industry, another construction industry with the building of homes for people that live outside of the city. So all of that, I just mentioned about 5, 6, 7 different industries. You're talking about rubber, steel, tools, glass, fabrics, roads and building homes. That's 7 industries right there. And gas, I don't know if I said that, oil, that are directly impacted by the growth of the automobile industry. So lots of other industries rise and grow substantially as a result of the growing popularity of cars. Another thing that we start to see emerge in the 1920s, a little bit, not to a substantial amount, but a little bit, is the idea of commercial aviation. Planes up through World War I had kind of been a novelty thing. Most people thought they were too dangerous. You had to be a real expert to fly, and the concept of building planes for more than one or two passengers, like the old biplanes, like they used in World War I, were not around yet. But by the mid 1920s, we start to look into the possibility of commercial aviation, and that is largely helped by Charles Lindbergh. And Charles Lindbergh's flight across from New York to Paris was a 33-hour flight. It took Charles Lindbergh to go from New York to Paris. But this was a very, very substantial moment. Not that we were alive when Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins landed on the moon, but Lindbergh's flight was as big a deal as that because he was accomplishing something, this flight across the ocean, that nobody else had ever done. And that was a big, big moment. And it probably made Charles Lindbergh the biggest celebrity, really, arguably the biggest celebrity in America during the 1920s. He was this hero because he had accomplished something that nobody else had done. And because of what Lindbergh did, Charles Lindbergh, people start to look into the possibility of commercial aviation, meaning planes for transporting goods and ultimately planes for transporting passengers from one place to another, mostly within the United States. Of course, early on, international flight was something that would come along a little bit later. But, the possibility of commercial aviation is something that, again, shrinks distance, making the country a closer and more viable place or idea to kind of travel from one part of the country to another. So that's a huge, huge change. We also see more and more industries consolidate during the 1920s, meaning big businesses get bigger. The biggest of all was U.S. Steel, which was the biggest corporation in the United States in the 1920s. U.S. Steel provided, I don't know how much, a large portion of the steel not only used in the United States but internationally as well. Something else that helps us in America is the fact that Europe is in shambles during the 1920s. Okay, because Europe is such a mess. All these European countries are depending on the United States for the goods that they used to produce, at least to some degree themselves, like steel, like rubber, like automobiles, like even textiles and some food products. So all kinds of things now coming from the United States and making their way to Europe, which again is going to help build our economy. Another big business that consolidates well during the 1920s is General Motors. General Motors becomes one of the largest companies in the United States, really challenging Ford Motor Company in the car industry as well. And they consolidate. General Motors, was one company its own, but then it consolidates by buying up some other smaller car companies that become the familiar names we know today, like Chevrolet and Buick and Pontiac and Oldsmobile and Cadillac. Basically, they all merge together to form one massive company that produces, all different kinds of vehicles for all different kinds of people. Okay, again, making businesses that are big even bigger, taking up a bigger market share of different markets, and making a lot of money for big business folks, big business executives who in the 1920s want to and do make a lot of money. So how does this affect the worker? It's an interesting situation for the worker during the 1920s in a lot of ways. It's really good for the laborer. okay, but not as much for the skilled labor, and we'll get to that in a minute. But in this age of capital, meaning economic growth in so many areas, we see substantial job opportunities provided, particularly for unskilled laborers. Unskilled laborers really benefit here, immigrants and otherwise. Um, Even though our immigrant numbers kind of go down during even though our immigrant numbers kind of go down during the 1920s because of nativism and some other factors, we do have still a substantial number of people to enter in the workforce and really provide the fuel to build the economy during this time. And a lot of business owners, a lot of big business owners, institute different policies and things to help these workers out and weaken the power of unions. One of these examples, one of these things they do is something called welfare capitalism. And basically, what welfare capitalism is this idea where business and factory owners basically take better care of their employees, offering things like paid vacations, better wages, even pension plans and stuff like that, workman's comp, health care, all kinds of different benefits. And the whole reason for this is to kind of weaken the power of unions, because they figure if the employer takes better care of the workers, then if the employer takes better care of the workers, they'd be less compelled to join a union. And that's one of the big things that we really see happen. Henry Ford is an example of this. Henry Ford certainly, because some of his anti-Semitic views, and he would be a little bit sympathetic to Hitler's cause during World War II. A lot of people kind of turned on Henry Ford, but he was always very good to his workers and employees, and made Ford Motor Company really a desirable place for people to work. So that is one aspect of somebody that took advantage of welfare capitalism. The concept, as early as the 1920s, is providing pension plans for employees was something that's really groundbreaking for the time. And it's all done as a way to discourage workers from joining unions. So as you can imagine, this represents a really hard time for organized labor. One thing organized labor groups like skilled craft unions like the AFL failed to do was was to kind of stick with the times and modernize with the way that society was changing. With the continued dependence on assembly lines, people are less dependent on skilled laborers. And groups like the AFL, as we know, represent primarily skilled laborers. So because of this, we see AFL membership kind of dwindle a little bit during the 1920s, as well as their overall political and social influence begins to wane a little bit, begins to become a little bit less as the 1920s kind of progress. And that's a big problem for them. They bounce back. They'd eventually bounce back, but the 1920s represent a really hard time for these skilled labor unions. All right, so moving on. Let's talk a little bit more about the economic shift. Now, I've been teasing this for a while. I've been teasing this for a while, this idea of the economic shift, all the way back in chapter 17 when we talked about the move from farms to factories. By the 1920s, it's becoming more and more evident that we've moved away from the era of the farmer and moved on to the age of industry. In the 1920s, we see millions, 2-3 million people leave their farms to try to find work in the cities because farming is no longer profitable. Farmers, as we know, are not as educated as people in the cities, therefore have difficulty understanding the economic circumstances that they have to deal with. They're increasingly troubled by the growth of mechanized farming. In other words, commercial farming. which is bad for the individual farmer. Commercial farming continues to grow, and this continues to take its toll on your regular everyday farmer. One of the problems that farmers always do when this happens is they produce more food. And this, of course, is a problem because as farming technology modernizes and grows, farmers start producing more. This leads to big surpluses, which farmers are kind of unable to sell, meaning they lose money. Some farmers seek a method called parity, where basically farmers, like independent farmers, agree to set a price, an equitable price for their farming goods, and kind of agree, not to charge more than that, so that way they can at least make back the cost of production on, whatever they're growing and trying to sell. But profits continue to dwindle, and this is a big problem for farmers during the 1920s. And it really represents how we're moving away from farming as the number one vehicle in the country for occupation and financial production to other things. So it makes America now becoming a very different place. The perfect example of this is something that we're going to call super important AP point number 25, Mark Price, is the McNary-Haugen Bill. Now, the McNary-Haugen Bill actually came through 4 times. Now, what do we know about something that's called a bill? One thing to know about a bill, that means it never became law. Now, the McNary-Haugen Bill was this plan by the federal government to basically buy up excess farm products from farmers. So the government will buy up excess farm products from farmers so it can kind of drive up farm prices and crop values. And then the government would basically sell the excess crops at a loss to foreign markets. Particularly Europe, because Europe's in a mess because of World War I. So this was meant to appease, obviously, the farming regions like the Great Plains of the United States that depend so much on farming and agriculture for money. But in your more urban areas, which are growing substantially, the McNary-Haugen Bill isn't very popular because let's think about this for a minute. Why would the government want to pass a law that is going to lose the government money? Because that's the idea. The government's going to buy up crops and then sell them at a loss to foreign nations to prop up the agricultural market. Well, 4 separate times they tried to pass this, and 4 separate times it was voted down. 2 times the bill got vetoed by Calvin Coolidge. So the McNary-Haugen Bill ultimately fails 4 times, and I think it's very symbolic, and this is what you want to know. This is symbolic of how our country has kind of now officially moved from the age of agriculture to the age of industry, where the future of America is not in its farmer, but in the continued industrial growth and opportunity provided by industrial giants in the cities. And the failure of the McNary-Haugen Bill is a really substantial and important example of this. So again, it's a idea for the federal government to buy excess farm products from farmers to basically drive crop prices up, and then the government would sell these products to foreign markets at a loss. Fails 4 times in Congress, and Coolidge vetoes it 2 times. So the death of the farmer is slow and painful. So again, we kind of just talked about the long-term ramifications of that. The long-term ramifications, again, like I just said, kind of the move from America officially and finally, there's finality to this from the age of agriculture to the age of industry. Besides big business, who else is doing well in America during this time? The segment of the employed that is doing well besides big business is fairly simple. If you read about it and think about it and look about it, it's not the middle class that's not growing at an astronomical rate. A little bit, certainly not the skilled labor class. But the people that are really benefiting here is the American laborer in general. The unskilled labor now has plentiful job opportunities, and with things like welfare capitalism and better pay and work opportunities, this is really an age for the labor, industrial, factory worker to really gain opportunity and grow and take advantage of it in America, right? By the end of the 1920s, laborers, your typical day labor were, many of them owned cars, owned homes, and things that 20, 10, 15, 10, 20 years before hadn't even dreamed of. And now these things were becoming more viable and possible for a much larger segment of the American population. They're not wealthy, they're not, they're not extravagant, but they have more things and the opportunity to, provide more stability for their families and things of that nature. So so that'll do it for today, and we'll continue on next time. See you.